I watched in horror as my cherished home crumbled into the river below, bulldozed on the orders of an HOA president who had no idea my brother had just been sworn in as Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. But when Eleanor comes after me one final time with gasoline and matches, will her desperate revenge destroy everything my community worked to rebuild? I still remember the exact moment my peaceful life at Riverdale Heights began to fall apart. The bulldozer's engine roared to life outside my kitchen window, jolting me from my morning coffee. Not again. Eleanor Winters stood beside it, clipboard in hand, her blonde bob unmoved by the spring breeze. "Mr. Williams," she called out with that fake smile that never reached her eyes, "we need to discuss your continued violations." I stepped onto my porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath my feet. My late wife Sarah had picked this riverside cottage specifically for that homey sound. "What seems to be the problem now, Eleanor?" She pointed her manicured finger at my mailbox. "That shade of blue isn't approved in the HOA handbook. Page 17. Section 4 clearly states all mailboxes must be either forest green or matte black." This was the 5th complaint this week. Yesterday it was my bird feeder, attracting unsightly wildlife. The day before, my garden gnome collection lowered property values. "I've had this mailbox for 15 years, I explained calmly. "Long before you became HOA president." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Grandfather clauses don't apply when the board votes unanimously to update standards, which we did last month." I noticed my neighbors watching from behind curtains. Nobody dared to stand against Eleanor, since she'd forced the Thompson family to sell after their daughter's wheelchair ramp violated aesthetic guidelines. "I'll consider repainting it," I said, trying to keep peace. "You have 48 hours before the first fine. $100 per day after that." She glanced past me at Sarah's rose garden. "And those non-native plant species will need to be addressed too." My heart thumped harder. "Those roses aren't going anywhere. My wife planted them before she died." Eleanor's face didn't soften. "Sentiment doesn't override regulations, Mr. Williams. The board meets tonight to discuss further actions." As she walked away, my phone buzzed. My brother James was calling, probably about his big promotion ceremony tomorrow. I couldn't burden him with my HOA troubles now. "Hey James, what's up? Just confirming you're coming tomorrow. Big day for me. Wouldn't miss it," I promised, watching Eleanor take photos of my property from different angles. "Everything okay? You sound stressed," James asked. "Just some neighborhood stuff. Nothing important." If only I'd known how wrong I was. That afternoon, I found a formal letter in my mailbox. The HOA demanded immediate removal of Sarah's rose garden, citing water conservation ordinances. They'd scheduled an emergency landscaping intervention if I didn't comply within 24 hours. I called Gregory, a retired lawyer 2 doors down who'd been kind to me since Sarah's passing. "They can't do this legally," Gregory assured me over coffee on his screened porch. "The roses were planted before the water restrictions. Plus, you've installed that rainwater collection system." "Eleanor doesn't care about legality," I sighed. "She wants conformity." Gregory leaned forward. "There's more going on. Have you seen the planning documents for Riverdale Heights Phase 2? He spread out papers showing luxury condos planned along our riverfront, exactly where my cottage stood. "Eleanor's husband works for the development company," Gregory whispered. "They need your land, but you've refused to sell." Ice formed in my stomach. "So these violations are just harassment to force me out?" "I believe so. Be careful, friend." That night, I photographed every inch of my property, documenting the condition of everything, especially Sarah's roses. Something told me I'd need proof soon. The next morning, I dressed for James's ceremony. As I locked my front door, Eleanor appeared with 3 board members and the bulldozer driver. "Just some approved community improvements," she said sweetly when I questioned the machinery. "Nothing that concerns your property directly." The man operating the bulldozer wouldn't meet my eyes. "I'll be back this evening," I told her firmly. "No work should happen on or near my property while I'm gone." Eleanor smiled. "Enjoy your brother's special day, Mr. Williams. We'll see you when you return." As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The bulldozer was moving toward my property line, and Eleanor was on her phone, gesturing animatedly. I nearly turned around, but I couldn't miss James's moment. He'd supported me through Sarah's illness and death. I just have to deal with whatever HOA nonsense Eleanor was planning when I got back. If only I'd known that my whole life was about to be pushed into the river, I might never have left my home that day. Blood drained from my face as I turned onto my street that evening. Police cars with flashing lights lined the road. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering behind their hands. Where my cottage had stood that morning, there was nothing but broken foundation and splintered wood. The rest had tumbled down the steep riverbank into the water below. I slammed on my brakes and stumbled out of my car. What happened? Where is my house? Eleanor stood with the HOA board members, looking unnaturally calm. Mr. Williams, we tried calling you multiple times. What have you done? My voice didn't sound like my own. Your property was deemed structurally unsound during our inspection today, she explained, handing me a document. The board voted for emergency demolition to protect neighboring properties. I stared at the paper, unable to process the words. This is impossible. My home was perfectly sound. Officer Reyes, who'd coached my nephew's baseball team last summer, approached looking uncomfortable. I'm sorry, sir. They had permits. Falsified permits, said Gregory, pushing through the crowd with a walking cane. I called the county office. Nothing was approved for demolition today. Eleanor's smile tightened. The paperwork is all in order, I assure you. I suddenly realized what was gone forever. Sarah's wedding dress preserved in tissue paper, our photo albums, the wooden box with her ashes on the mantel. 30 years of memories bulldozed into mud. My knees gave out. Officer Reyes caught me before I hit the ground. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, I managed to say. Eleanor shrugged. The HOA bylaws protect U.S. from litigation when acting in community interest. Page 43, paragraph 6. Camera flashed. Maria from across the street was documenting everything. This isn't right, she called out. We never voted for this. The board voted, Eleanor corrected, as elected representatives. Gregory helped me to my feet. You can stay with me tonight, he offered quietly. As we turned to leave, Eleanor added, Oh, and Mr. Williams? Your mailbox and those non-native roses have been removed as well. Consider all violations cleared. Something inside me snapped. I spun around, pointing a shaking finger at her. You wanted my land. This was never about violations. For a split second, Eleanor's mask slipped, revealing something calculating in her eyes before she recovered. That's quite an accusation. I hope you have proof. Maria stepped forward. I have proof. I've been recording HOA meetings for the newsletter. Last month, Eleanor specifically mentioned wanting to clear obstacles for the riverfront development. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Eleanor's husband tugged her sleeve, whispering urgently. This meeting is over, Eleanor announced. Please disperse or you'll all receive notices of violation. As neighbors reluctantly drifted away, my phone rang. It was James, wondering why I'd left his ceremony so quickly. Something happened. I choked out. My house? It's gone. What do you mean, gone? James sounded alarmed. The HOA bulldozed it. Everything's gone, James. Sarah's ashes, our photos, everything. His voice changed instantly. Don't say another word. Don't sign anything. I'm on my way. Eleanor was watching me from her porch as I ended the call. She had no idea who my brother was or what she just unleashed. That night, in Gregory's spare bedroom, I couldn't sleep. Through the window, I could see the empty space where my home had stood for decades. The rushing river seemed to be crying Sarah's name. I clutched the only thing I had left, the jacket I'd worn to James's ceremony, with our wedding photo tucked in the pocket. I'll make this right, I whispered to Sarah's image. Somehow. At dawn, a loud knock startled me awake. Gregory opened the front door to find James standing there in his formal attire, the same clothes from yesterday's ceremony where he'd been sworn in as Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. "Where's my brother?" James demanded, his voice carrying the weight of his new position. Eleanor chose that exact moment to step outside her house. She froze when she saw the official car in the driveway and James's unmistakable robes. "Who is that?" she asked her husband, loud enough for us to hear. Gregory smiled for the first time since yesterday's disaster. "That, Mrs. Winters, is Justice James Williams of the state Supreme Court. And you just bulldozed his brother's house." The blood drained from Eleanor's face as James turned toward her, his expression promising consequences she'd never imagined when she decided to destroy my home. "They did what?" James roared, slamming his fist on his mahogany desk. The family photo of us fishing together toppled over. I'd never seen my brother this angry in my life. His face turned crimson as he stared at the photos on my phone showing nothing but rubble where my home once stood. "Eleanor Winters and her HOA bulldozed my house into the river while I was at your ceremony," I explained, my voice cracking. "Everything I owned. All of Sarah's things gone." James paced his chambers, his new judicial robes billowing behind him. "This woman bulldozed your house because of garden gnomes and a blue mailbox?" He stopped suddenly. "Did they give you any written notice? Any formal hearings?" I shook my head. "Just daily violation notices. Nothing about demolition." My brother's secretary poked her head in. "Justice Williams, you have the governor on line 1. Cancel all my appointments for the week," James instructed her. "And get me Judge Martinez, the county sheriff, and the district attorney on a conference call immediately." I sat numbly as James made call after call, legal terms flying around me. Criminal trespass, destruction of property, civil rights violations, emergency injunctions. "Stay here tonight," James insisted, his voice gentler now. "The guest room is ready." At dawn, we drove to Riverdale Heights together. I hadn't slept at all. James wore his everyday clothes, but carried his robes in a garment bag. "Evidence preservation," he muttered as we pulled up to where my home had been. Yellow police tape now surrounded my property. 3 police cars sat in front. Eleanor stormed out of her house in a pink bathrobe when she spotted us. "This is harassment," she shouted, marching toward us. The HOA acted within its legal rights. Page 43, paragraph 6 clearly states. "Mrs. Winters," the sheriff interrupted, stepping between us. "I have a court order to deliver." He handed her an official document. "You're being summoned to an emergency hearing at 2 p.m. today regarding the unauthorized demolition of private property." Eleanor snatched the paper. "This is absurd. I'll call my lawyer. We were fixing a safety hazard." James stepped forward then, and I saw the exact moment Eleanor registered who he was. Her face drained of color as he removed his judicial robes from the garment bag and slipped them on right there in the street. "Mrs. Winters," James said formally, "I am Justice James Williams of the state Supreme Court. While I have recused myself from presiding over your case due to obvious conflict of interest, I will inform you that every judge in this circuit now knows exactly what happened here." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Neighbors began appearing on their porches, watching the scene unfold. This is intimidation," she stammered. "No, Mrs. Winters," James replied calmly. "This is what due process actually looks like. Something you denied my brother before destroying his home." A news van pulled up, and a reporter jumped out with a cameraman. "Who called the media?" Eleanor shrieked. "I did," said a small voice. We all turned to see Maria from across the street, still in her nursing scrubs from night shift. "I recorded the whole demolition on my phone yesterday. I was too scared to stop it, but I'm not too scared to show the world what you did." Eleanor retreated toward her house, but stopped when 2 plainclothes detectives approached her door with evidence bags. They were boxing up her computer and files. "You can't do this," she cried. "Search warrant," one detective replied, holding up a document, "signed by Judge Martinez an hour ago." I watched as Eleanor ran inside, slamming her door. Through her front window, I could see her frantically making phone calls. "James," I whispered, "what's going to happen now?" My brother put his arm around my shoulders. Justice, Robert. Real justice. That afternoon at the courthouse, I sat behind my lawyer. James had found me the best property attorney in the state. Eleanor arrived with 3 lawyers of her own, looking polished and confident again in a cream-colored suit. This will all be thrown out, she hissed as she passed me. My husband plays golf with Senator Wilson. Judge Martinez entered, a stern woman with silver hair who glared at Eleanor over her reading glasses. Mrs. Winters, this court has reviewed preliminary evidence of your actions as HOA president. Judge Martinez began. The demolition of Mr. Williams' home appears to be not only unauthorized by proper HOA procedures, but potentially criminal in nature. Eleanor's lawyer stood. Your Honor, the HOA bylaws clearly. I've reviewed the bylaws, Judge Martinez interrupted. The court has copies from 2020, 2021, and 2022. Interestingly, the demolition clause only appears in the version provided today. Would you care to explain that discrepancy? Eleanor whispered frantically to her lawyer, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. From my brother's guest room window that night, we watched as a moving truck appeared at Eleanor's house. Men carried boxes out while she supervised, checking her watch repeatedly. She's running, James said grimly, already dialing the sheriff. Eleanor managed to load 3 suitcases into her Mercedes before police cruisers blocked her driveway. The officers approached with papers in hand. Is she being arrested? I asked, pressing my face against the window. No, James replied, but the court has frozen her assets and ordered her not to leave town while under investigation. She's not going anywhere. As the police spoke with Eleanor, I noticed lights turning on in houses throughout the neighborhood. One by one, my neighbors were coming outside, gathering on the sidewalk, watching as Eleanor's escape plan collapsed. Would they finally stand up against her tyranny? Or were they just watching another show in our neighborhood drama? I woke to frantic knocking at James's front door. Sunrise barely lit the sky as I stumbled downstairs in borrowed pajamas. When I opened the door, I found Maria standing there, still in her nursing scrubs. You need to come quick, she gasped out of breath. Everyone's at Eleanor's house. It's happening now. I threw on clothes and raced with Maria back to Riverdale Heights. What I saw left me speechless. At least 30 neighbors had formed a human chain around Eleanor's property. Some held handmade signs, HOA tyranny stops now, and justice for Robert. What's going on? I asked, spotting Gregory, the retired lawyer who lived 2 doors down from me. Gregory stepped forward, leaning on his cane. Eleanor tried to delete files from the HOA cloud storage at 4 a.m. I set up alerts months ago because I didn't trust her. He patted a thick leather binder under his arm. But I kept copies of everything. We're making sure she doesn't destroy any more evidence, added Maria, joining the human chain. My husband called everyone after your brother's people left last night. Eleanor appeared at her window, phone pressed to her ear, looking furious. When she spotted me, she yanked her curtains closed. I should have done this long ago, said a tall man I recognized as Dr. Thompson from the end of the street. She threatened to put a lien on my house when my wife was dying of cancer because our lawn wasn't mowed for 2 weeks. More stories poured out. Elderly neighbors on fixed incomes hit with surprise special assessments. Young families fined for children's toys visible from the street. Selective enforcement against anyone who questioned Eleanor's decisions. But why didn't anyone stop her? I asked, bewildered by how much pain one person had caused. She started small, Gregory explained, opening his binder to show me meticulously organized documents. First it was reasonable things, stopping the guy who wanted to paint his house neon green, fixing the broken playground. Then she replaced elected board members with her friends through loopholes in the bylaws. He flipped through pages of financial records. Look here, the landscaping company that charges triple market rate, owned by her cousin. The construction firm that got the clubhouse renovation contract. Her husband sits on their board. A police car pulled up, and Gregory immediately approached the officer. We have reason to believe evidence destruction is in progress, he said, handing over some papers. These are copies of financial records showing possible embezzlement from HOA funds. The officer radioed for backup as a sleek black Audi screeched to a halt. A man in an expensive suit emerged, Eleanor's husband, David Winters. "What is this circus?" he demanded, pushing toward Eleanor's door. "Get off my property, all of you." "Not until the police finish their investigation," Gregory replied calmly. David's face reddened. "Do you know who I am? I'll have all of you sued for harassment." "Do you know who I am?" countered a soft voice behind him. James had arrived, dressed in a simple suit without his judicial robes. "I believe the police have some questions about your involvement in the Riverside Development Project, Mr. Winters." David's angry expression faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." "That's odd," James said, checking his phone. "Because I have emails between you and Apex developers discussing how acquiring my brother's property would complete the riverfront parcel for your luxury condos." He looked up. Emails sent the day before his house was mysteriously bulldozed. The color drained from David's face. By noon, news vans lined our street. Reporters interviewed neighbors while police carried out boxes of documents from Eleanor's home. Inside the community center that afternoon, we gathered for an emergency meeting. Gregory stood at the podium with the county registrar. The HOA bylaws filed with the county never authorized demolition of homes, the registrar explained, showing side-by-side documents on a projector screen. "These appear to have been altered sometime in the last month." Murmurs spread through the crowd. "Furthermore," Gregory added, "I've uncovered that $427,000 of our HOA funds were transferred to a shell company called Riverside Holdings LLC in the past year." He paused dramatically. "A company owned by David and Eleanor Winters." Gasps filled the room. The HOA treasurer, a timid man named Frank who always supported Eleanor, stood up shakily. I signed those transfers," he admitted, voice trembling. "Eleanor said they were for the new security system and landscaping improvements. She had invoices and everything." "Forged invoices," Gregory corrected, displaying documents on the screen. "The real vendors were never paid." The afternoon court session was packed with my neighbors. Eleanor and David sat with their lawyers, no longer looking confident. Judge Martinez entered, reviewing new evidence before looking up sternly. "Based on the financial records provided by Mr. Gregory Peters and testimony from board members, this court finds probable cause for criminal charges of fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, and destruction of property." Eleanor's lawyer jumped up. "Your Honor, my client was acting in good faith." "Save it for trial," Judge Martinez interrupted. "Mrs. Winters, Mr. Winters, please stand." They rose slowly, Eleanor's perfect posture finally failing her. "You are both remanded to custody with bail set at $500,000 each," the judge declared. "Surrender your passports and any assets purchased with HOA funds." As officers approached with handcuffs, Eleanor suddenly pointed at me. "This is all your fault," she screamed. "If you had just removed those hideous gnomes and fixed your mailbox like everyone else, none of this would have happened." The courtroom fell silent. "No, Eleanor," I said quietly. "This happened because you thought rules only applied to other people." As they were led away, Eleanor thrashed against the officers. "You'll regret this. I have connections. This isn't over." David hung his head, whispering something in his wife's ear that made her suddenly stop struggling. Outside the courthouse, neighbors surrounded me with hugs and invitations to stay in their homes until mine could be rebuilt. "We're going to fix this," Maria promised, tears in her eyes. Together, Gregory approached with several board members. "We voted to dissolve the current HOA structure," he announced. "We'd like you to help us create something better." As everyone talked excitedly about community cleanups and fundraisers, James pulled me aside. "There's something else you should know," he said gravely. "The developer David was working with, they've already broken ground upstream. If that project goes through, it could cause flooding that would affect this entire neighborhood." I looked at my newfound allies, celebrating our small victory. Should I tell them that an even bigger battle might be looming? one that could wash away not just my home, but all of theirs too. They found my wife's wedding ring, I shouted, my voice cracking as I held up the mud-covered gold band that search volunteers had just pulled from the riverbank. Neighbors who had ignored me for years now worked side by side, forming a human chain along the river, searching for my treasures. Maria rushed over, crying happy tears. I knew we'd find something special today. She hugged me tightly, this woman who had barely waved to me before Eleanor's reign of terror began. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air where my home once stood. Gregory, clipboard in hand, directed volunteers like a general. The foundation needs to be higher than before, he explained, showing me blueprints. This way, even if the river floods, your new home will stay safe. My temporary home, James's guest bedroom, had become command central for what the local news was calling the Battle of Riverdale Heights. Reporters camped outside daily, hungry for updates on Eleanor's upcoming trial and the neighborhood's transformation. You've become quite famous, James said, pointing to the front page of the newspaper where my story headlined. People across the country are checking their HOA contracts because of you. I didn't want fame. I just wanted my life back. A knock at the door interrupted dinner. James answered and returned with Eleanor's husband, Robert, standing nervously in the hallway. I found these in our safe, Robert whispered, handing me a folder. Eleanor's plans for the entire neighborhood. She was working with platinum developers to force everyone out, starting with you because your property had river access. The documents showed a massive luxury development that would have replaced our homes. My hands shook as I flipped through architectural drawings with my property marked as Phase 1. Why are you showing me this now? I asked, Robert's eyes filled with tears. Because she made me choose between her schemes and our marriage. I chose wrong for years. I can't undo what happened to your home, but I can try to make things right. Gregory reviewed the documents, his legal mind working overtime. This is the smoking gun. With these plans and the falsified HOA documents, Eleanor's facing serious prison time. That night, thunder rattled the windows as a storm rolled in. I couldn't sleep, thinking about all I'd lost, and strangely what I'd gained. This community that had ignored each other for years was now connected through crisis. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You think you've won? This isn't over. I showed James, who immediately called the prosecutor. Eleanor was released on bail this afternoon, he confirmed, his voice grim. The judge didn't consider her a flight risk. Lightning illuminated the window, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the rain, watching the house. When I blinked, they were gone. Should we be worried? I asked James. The bail conditions forbid her from contacting you or coming near the property, he reassured me. She'd be foolish to violate that. But foolish wasn't Eleanor's problem. Pride was. The construction site security camera alert pinged my phone at 3 a.m. The night vision footage showed a hooded figure moving through the rain toward the fresh framework of my new home, carrying something in their hand. My blood ran cold when I realized what it was. A gas can. James, wake up, I shouted, already dialing 911. Eleanor's at the construction site. Flames shot into the night sky as I raced toward my half-built home in James's car. Eleanor had already emptied half the gas can across the fresh lumber when police cruisers screeched onto the scene, their flashing lights cutting through the rain. Drop the gasoline now, an officer shouted through a megaphone. Instead, Eleanor struck a match. The tiny flame flickered in the rain as she stood frozen, her face twisted with hatred. Everything I worked for is gone because of you, she screamed at me across the yard. If I can't have this property, nobody will. Robert appeared from nowhere, running toward his wife. Eleanor, please. This isn't you. The distraction gave an officer time to tackle Eleanor, the match flying harmlessly into a puddle. She fought wildly as they handcuffed her, screaming threats that echoed through the neighborhood. You don't understand. That property was promised to me. The developer paid me $50,000 already. Neighbors emerged from their homes in pajamas and raincoats, watching in shocked silence as Eleanor was placed in a police car. She confessed, Gregory whispered. recording everything on his phone, on camera with witnesses. By morning, Eleanor's bail was revoked. The prosecutor added attempted arson to her growing list of charges. I couldn't sleep for days, jumping at every sound, expecting more revenge. Robert filed for divorce the following week. "I'm selling our house," he told me, looking 10 years younger without Eleanor's shadow over him. "Half the money will go toward rebuilding your home. It's the right thing to do." Summer arrived, bringing work crews daily. My neighbors took shifts bringing lunch, checking progress, and keeping me company. Maria organized a donation drive that filled a storage unit with household items for my new home. "We found something else," Gregory said one blazing July afternoon, carefully holding a mud-covered metal box. The river gave up another treasure. Inside was my wife's jewelry box, waterlogged but intact. Her mother's pearl necklace, our anniversary watch, and, most precious, her wedding ring lay nestled inside. My hands trembled as I slipped the ring onto my pinky finger. She'd be so happy to see everyone coming together like this. Eleanor's trial began in September. I dreaded testifying, facing her again. "Just tell the truth," James advised as we drove to court. "That's all you need to do." Eleanor looked small behind the defense table, her designer clothes replaced by a plain navy suit, her once perfect hair now dull and limp. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away. The jury took only 3 hours to find her guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, destruction of property, and attempted arson. The judge, a colleague of my brother's, showed no mercy. 20 years, he pronounced, his gavel crack echoing through the courtroom, and full financial restitution to all victims. Cameras flashed as Eleanor was led away, her face blank with shock. Winter melted into spring as my new home neared completion. On moving day, the entire neighborhood arrived with furniture, food, and flowers. "We have something to show you," Gregory said, guiding me to the front yard where a stone bench sat under a flowering cherry tree. The plaque read, "Rose Garden, where new beginnings take root." "My wife would have loved this," I whispered, touching the cool stone. That evening, as neighbors gathered on my new porch for an impromptu housewarming, James raised his glass. "To communities that stand together," he said, "and to brothers who never have to face bullies alone." Robert, now dating Maria in a surprise twist that delighted everyone, added his own toast, "To second chances." I looked around at these people, once strangers despite living feet away, now friends brought together by disaster. The new community charter hung framed in my entryway, signed by every homeowner. Its first rule, written in bold, "Homes are for people, not power." As fireflies blinked in the summer twilight, children played tag across lawns no longer governed by petty rules. Dogs barked joyfully without fear of violation notices. Gardens grew wild and beautiful. "You know," Gregory said quietly beside me, "Eleanor wrote me from prison last week." My heart stuttered. What did she want? "To apologize," he said, looking as surprised as I felt. "She said losing everything made her see what actually matters." I looked at my rebuilt home, different from before, but somehow better, and nodded. Sometimes that's what it takes.